In 1853 Tennessee, the walls of the plantation held secrets no master could see. Among the enslaved was Louisa, a young woman whose quiet needlework carried deadly intent. With every stitch, she wove defiance into the very fabric of the big house. Tonight, we uncover her story, a tale of desperation, cunning, and resistance that reveals how even the smallest act of rebellion shook the pillars of slavery. The sewing room is still. Sunlight filters through narrow panes, dust dancing in its beams. Louisa sits bent over fine garments destined for the planter's family, lace collars, linen shirts, delicate hems. Her hands are steady, her needle glinting with each pass. But hidden in the thread, in the seams invisible to the eye, lies a substance meant not to adorn, but to kill. She glances toward the doorway. Outside, footsteps echo across the porch. Voices drift in, laughter, orders, the rhythm of plantation life. To the family upstairs, Louisa is only another pair of quiet hands, a servant whose labor clothes their bodies. But inside her chest beats a secret louder than any heartbeat should. What drove her to this moment? How did one enslaved woman find the courage or the desperation to weaponize her craft? And what happened when suspicion spread, threatening not just her life, but the fragile balance of an entire plantation? This is the story of Louisa, the seamstress who dared to stitch poison into the garments of power. By 1853, slavery in America was both a machine of staggering brutality and a system on the edge of collapse. Cotton was king. Tennessee was thriving. On forced labor, and enslaved people were trapped in a cycle of work, obedience, and punishment. Yet beneath the surface, resistance simmered. Most forms of resistance were small, almost invisible. Tools broken, work slowed, food stolen, songs sung in secret. But some acts were daring, dangerous, and nearly unthinkable. Among them was the act of poisoning, a rebellion that struck directly at the bodies of masters and mistresses. For enslaved women, who often cooked, cleaned, or sewed, the opportunity to slip resistance into the daily life of the big house was both possible and perilous. Louisa's story is not widely known. It comes to us through fragments, local reports, whispers in historical records, accounts of poison plots that terrified slaveholders across the South. She represents a hidden chapter of resistance, the ways enslaved women turned the very skills demanded of them into weapons of survival. Why does this story matter today? Because it reveals the depth of human resilience, the courage to resist even when the cost could be death. Louisa's needle carried more than thread. It carried the unspoken defiance of generations. Tonight, on Forgotten Chains, we step into Tennessee in 1853 to piece together her tale. Tennessee plantations in the 1850s were a theater of contradictions. Wealthy families lived in mansions adorned with fine furniture and imported china. But those luxuries were stitched, cleaned, and carried by enslaved hands. Louisa was one of those hands. Young, skilled, and assigned to sewing, she lived in the shadow of the big house. Her days were filled with fabric, delicate silks for the mistress, sturdy cotton for the children, coats for the master. She was trusted enough to handle their garments, yet never trusted as a person. In the quarters, whispers spread of resistance. Stories told by firelight spoke of women who had slipped powders into stews, or men who had vanished into the woods, seeking freedom. Every act was dangerous, but every act reminded them they were not powerless. Louisa listened, her own resolve forming stitch by stitch. Poison was the hidden fear of every slave-holding family. Masters often spoke of it in hushed tones, watching their meals carefully, distrusting their servants even as they relied on them. For Louisa, sewing offered a different kind of access. Cloth brushed against skin, seams rested against throats, and garments absorbed what was hidden within. She learned, perhaps from whispers among the enslaved, that certain powders could be worked into seams, where sweat and skin would draw them out slowly. We don't know her exact sources. It may have been herbs gathered in secret, or substances, obtained through careful connections. What we do know is that she chose her weapon carefully, not fire, not blade, but thread. Imagine her in that sewing room, the fabric smooth beneath her fingers, the powder pinched, folded into seams, invisible to any eye but her own. Each stitch was a gamble, each garment a test of fate. She worked silently, surrounded by risk. If discovered, the punishment would be swift and brutal. But for Louisa, the needle became more than a tool of labor. It became a blade against bondage. Plantation life was a web of observation. Every cough, every faintness, every unexplained illness in the big house was scrutinized. At first, perhaps it seemed coincidence. The mistress complained of weakness. A child grew pale. The master felt a fever burning his body. Doctors were summoned, blaming bad air or spoiled food. Yet whispers grew. Could it be the work of poison? The enslaved knew the danger immediately. Suspicion rarely fell only on the guilty. Entire quarters could be punished for the actions of one. Whips cracked hardest when fear spread. One account suggests that Louisa's secret did not remain hidden. A seam unpicked, a thread examined, a rumor spoken under pressure. Whether betrayed or discovered, her act came into the open. The response was swift. Plantation justice did not wait for trials. Louisa was dragged from the sewing room, her needle torn from her hands. Imagine the terror, yet also the steel in her eyes. Facing her captors, she may have known the price she would pay, but she had already made her choice, to resist, even in silence, even in death. The historical record is fragmentary. Some accounts claim Louisa was executed, hung or beaten to death, as a warning. Others suggest she was sold downriver, a fate often considered worse than death, tearing her from any connection she had in Tennessee. What is certain is the ripple her act created. Slaveholders across the region tightened control, watching their enslaved cooks and seamstresses with renewed suspicion. Louisa's rebellion became part of a larger pattern that haunted the South, the fear that those most trusted within households could become the greatest threat. For the enslaved, her act was a story of courage. In whispered retellings, Louisa's needle was not just a tool of defiance, but a symbol that even within the heart of bondage, resistance could be found in the smallest of stitches. Her story may have ended in silence, but her defiance echoed, part of the long struggle that would only end when slavery itself was torn apart by war. Louisa's name surfaces rarely in archives, yet her story carries weight far beyond its fragments. She represents countless women whose resistance was erased or left unrecorded. The sewing room, often seen as a space of domestic labor, became for Louisa a battlefield. Her needle was her weapon, her thread, her defiance. Her story reminds us that resistance did not always look like open revolt. Sometimes it was silent, hidden, dangerous, and deeply personal. To remember Louisa is to honor those whose courage never made it into history books. It is to recognize that freedom was not given. It was taken, risked, fought for, even in the quietest corners of slavery's shadow. Louisa's story forces us to see slavery not only as a system of oppression, but also as a battlefield of resistance. Enslaved men and women were denied freedom, family, and even their own bodies. Yet within that darkness, they found ways to fight back, sometimes with words, sometimes with flight, and sometimes, like Louisa, with deadly defiance. It is tempting to think of resistance only in grand terms, revolts, escapes, abolition. But Louisa's needle shows us another truth. Resistance can be woven into daily life, into the very tasks forced upon the oppressed. Her rebellion was dangerous, and it carried a cost. yet it spoke loudly of a truth slaveholders feared most. That control was never absolute. Today, her story challenges us to consider how resilience and courage appear in unexpected forms. It reminds us that history is not only about generals and battles, but about women in sewing rooms, making choices that risked everything. By remembering Louisa, we give voice to those silenced by chains. We acknowledge that freedom's thread was stitched by many hands, often unseen. You've just heard the story of Louisa, the enslaved seamstress who turned her needle into a weapon of defiance. If this story moved you, help us uncover more hidden chapters of history. Like this video to support Forgotten Chains, subscribe for more stories of courage and resistance, and ring the bell so you never miss our next episode. And if you want to go further, watch our episode on 1853, the slave Louisa who tried to poison her masters, a companion story that expands on this haunting tale. History is stitched together by the voices of the forgotten. By listening, by remembering, we honor their fight and carry their legacy forward.